Jax found a young woman chained to a burned cart at the edge of the ruined settlement. Exhausted and near death, she still held a fierce light in her eyes. She told him. Raiders had taken the others and left her behind. Her name was Elira. After giving her water, Jax promised to cut her free. Before we get started, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I've got something truly special coming your way tomorrow. The land had a way of swallowing men whole. Out here, in the broken country between the red canyons and the endless scrub plains, the sun didn't just beat down, it hunted. It cooked the skin, blistered the lips, and pressed the spirit into silence. Water was worth more than gold, and trust was worth even less. Jax Harlan knew these truths better than most. He rode a lean, dust-colored gelding along a half-forgotten trail, his wide-brim hat pulled low against the glare. His beard was rough, his eyes shadowed by the years. A rifle was slung loose in its scabbard, a revolver heavy on his hip, and a knife worn smooth by a calloused hand rested in his boot. He was the kind of man folks looked away from when he entered a town. Scarred, lean, carrying the weight of too many roads behind him. Not that he visited towns often. The law had a way of keeping its teeth sharp for men like him, and Jax had lived long enough on the edge to know better than to offer them his neck. So he rode the wild country, trading when he had to, stealing when he had no choice, and keeping to himself. But that day, the horizon betrayed him. A column of smoke rose where no smoke should be, thick and black against the pale sky. He stopped, his horse narrowing his eyes. It was too much for a cook fire, too wild for a brush blaze. That was the kind of smoke that came from ruin. He spat in the dust, muttered a curse, and considered turning away. Smoke never meant anything good. It meant someone else's tragedy, someone else's problem. And Jax had sworn a long time ago that other folks' problems weren't his concern. Still, his horse shifted beneath him, uneasy, as if the wind carried more than ash. Jax tugged the reins, muttering, "Damn fool's errand," and turned toward the smoke. The closer he rode, the worse it got. The smell hit first, burned wood, scorched flesh, that sour tang of death carried on the wind. Then came the silence. Not the quiet of empty plains, but the hollow stillness of something stolen away. No birds, no dogs. Just the faint groan of charred timber collapsing into itself. The settlement had been small. Maybe a dozen buildings clustered around a central well. Now it was nothing but black skeletons, the earth littered with broken glass and splintered wagons. Bodies lay scattered. Some face down in the dust, others curled as though trying to shield children or loved ones from what came. Jax dismounted, slowly, his boots crunching over the brittle remains of what once was a town. He moved like a man already expecting ghosts to rise. His hand hovered near his revolver. Raiders, maybe, or worse. Bands of scavengers who came after the killing, picking through bones for what little value remained. Jax had no wish to meet either, but something pulled him forward. He passed the well, its stonework cracked, the rope cut. A rocking chair lay burned into a crooked shape beside what had been a porch. Ash drifted on the wind like snow, clinging to his coat. He should have turned back, but then he heard it, faint, brittle, almost mistaken for the creak of a scorched beam, a clink. Metal against stone. Jax froze. His eyes scanned the wreckage, settling on a cart half-collapsed near the edge of the settlement. Its wheels were blackened, the wood charred, but one of them remained upright. And to that wheel, half hidden in shadow, something moved. He approached slowly, his boots silent in the ash. It was a woman, young, though not a girl. Her face streaked with soot, hair tangled and burned at the ends. She was bound by a heavy iron shackle at her wrist, chained to the wheel. Her lips were cracked, her skin raw from heat and smoke. She looked up at him with eyes that should have been empty by now but weren't. They were fierce, even through the fever haze. "Don't," she rasped, voice broken. "Don't let them come back." For a long moment, Jax just stood there. He had no stake in this. He'd buried enough faces in his memory to know what it meant to get involved, to take someone else's fight into your hands. But then the chain rattled again as she tried weakly to move, and something in her defiance caught him. She wasn't begging. She wasn't weeping. She was warning. Jax sighed, crouched, and studied the lock. "Hell of a fix," he muttered. He slipped a thin steel pick from his belt pouch, working it into the iron. A few twists, a grunt, and the shackle clicked open. The woman slumped forward, too weak to catch herself. He caught her under the arms, muttering, "Easy, girl. You fall. I'll have to haul your sorry hide twice as far." She weighed little more than a sack of grain. He carried her back to where his horse waited, but she stirred, forcing her head up. Who are you?" "Name's Jax," he said simply. He hoisted her onto the saddle, mounting behind to keep her steady. "And you're lucky I've got worse judgment than sense." The woman tried to speak again, but her strength failed. She slumped against him, and he kicked the horse forward, leaving the ashes behind. They rode until dusk, until the smoke of the ruined settlement was a smear on the horizon, and the land dipped into rocky hills. Jax found an outcrop, a shallow cave carved into stone, where the wind didn't cut so sharp. He set her down on a bedroll, covered her with his coat, and built a small fire. When he pressed a canteen to her lips, she drank greedily, coughing but refusing to stop. He had to pull it back before she drowned herself on the water. Then he tore strips from his own shirt, dampened them, and cleaned the raw edges of her wrists. Through it all, she didn't speak, just watched him with those fever-bright eyes, suspicious even in weakness. "You'll live," Jax said finally, settling by the fire. He chewed a strip of jerky, tossed another into the pot for broth. "Can't say if you'll thank me for it, but there it is." Her voice came quiet, scraped raw. Why help me?" Jax stared into the fire for a long while before answering. "Guess I've seen enough smoke." She closed her eyes, a tear cutting through the soot on her cheek. And for the first time in a long time, Jax Harlan, outlaw, drifter, man without ties, felt the stirrings of something he thought the desert had burned out of him long ago. Responsibility. It sat heavy, like a gun in his lap, and he knew, as the stars wheeled cold above the desert, that nothing would be simple from here on. Boat. The desert didn't heal quickly, and neither did people. By the time dawn crept across the rocks, painting the outcrop in gray light, Jax had already been awake for hours. He was a man who slept light and restless, never trusting the world to keep still while his eyes were closed. His fire had burned down to embers, his rifle rested across his knees, and his ears stayed tuned to every sigh of the wind. The girl stirred on the bedroll, a faint groan slipping from her throat. She tried to push herself up, but her body failed her. Jax leaned forward and pressed her back with a calloused hand. "Don't," he muttered. "You ain't ready." Her eyes cracked open, bleary, darting around as though trying to place herself. When they settled on him, suspicion sharpened the haze. She remembered the chain, the fire, the faces of the men who had left her to burn. And now there was this stranger, the outlaw she didn't yet know was outlaw, watching her like a hawk. Where are we?" she asked, her voice raw as gravel. "Somewhere they won't find you," Jax said. "That's all you need." "No." She shifted weakly under the blanket, tugging at her wrist as though expecting the iron to still be there. When she found only cloth and bandage, she stilled, staring at him with guarded confusion. "You freed me. Wouldn't be much point in dragging you out if I left you shackled." Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" Jax shrugged, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "Didn't see sense in leaving a soul to die slow." That's it. She didn't believe him. Not fully, but she didn't have the strength to argue. She sank back, silent, her eyes flicking to the fire. Jax rose, fetched the small pot, and set it near the coals. The scent of thin broth filled the space. He poured a measure into a tin cup, let it cool, then crouched beside her. Drink. She hesitated, staring at the cup as though it might hold poison. But thirst won out. She sipped, then drank deep, each swallow rough. When it was gone, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and gave him a look that was halfway between gratitude and defiance. "My name's Alara," she said at last. Jax tipped his hat back, studying her. "Didn't ask." "Well, now you know." For the first time, he almost smiled. The girl had fire in her, even half dead. The days blurred into a rhythm. Jax kept the fire low, never letting smoke rise high enough to betray their hideout. He hunted rabbit and quail with his rifle, sometimes snared them with wire. He carried water back from a spring 2 miles east, careful to mask his trail. And each time he returned, Alara was a little stronger. She could sit up after the second day. She could walk a few steps by the fourth. By the end of the first week, she was steady enough to fetch sticks for the fire, though she bristled when he reminded her not to overdo it. Her mistrust lingered, though. She asked questions he wouldn't answer: where he came from, what he wanted, whether he had a family. Jax kept his words short, as though every syllable cost him something. The less she knew, the safer she'd be. At least, that's what he told himself. But he couldn't help noticing the way she watched him. Her eyes tracked the method in his movements. How he cleaned his rifle with practiced ease. How he cut meat with care. How he scanned the horizon every few minutes like a man who expected death to come riding. And sometimes, at night when she thought he was asleep, he heard her whispering to herself. Names, faces, the fragments of a life burned to ash. He never asked her to stop. He knew what it was to carry ghosts. On the 8th day, she finally asked what had been circling between them since the fire. "Those men, the ones who burned us out. They'll come back, won't they?" Jax didn't look up from where he was, sharpening his knife. "Maybe." Her fists tightened on her knees. "Then we have to stop them." Jax paused, the blade glinting in the firelight. He looked at her, thin, pale, still mending, and shook his head. "You ain't ready to stop." "Anyone?" Her voice hardened. "Then teach me." That caught him off guard. He gave a dry laugh. "You don't know what you're asking." "I do." Her eyes blazed. "I saw what they did. My father tried to fight them. He didn't even make it to his rifle. My mother begged, and they laughed. They left me chained to die. I won't be that again. I can't." The silence stretched. The only sound was the crack of the fire and the low moan of desert wind through the rocks. Jax studied her, weighing something heavy inside himself. He'd spent years avoiding this very path. Teaching her meant tying himself to her. It meant being responsible for what she became. It meant breaking the rule he'd lived by since he'd left the world behind. Never care, never stay, never fight for someone else's cause. But the look in her eyes reminded him of something he'd buried a long time ago, the face of a man who once believed he could do some good. He slid the knife back into its sheath. "Fine," he muttered. "But you listen, and you don't quit. Out here, half-learned gets you killed." Alara nodded once. "I won't quit." Her training began. The next morning, Jax didn't start with guns or knives. He started with fire. "If you can't make flame, you can't live," he told her. He showed her how to strike flint against steel, how to nestle sparks in dry grass, how to breathe life into it without smothering it. Her first attempts fizzled, but she kept at it until sweat streaked her soot-marked face. By dusk, she coaxed, a spark into flame, and the pride in her eyes shone brighter than the fire itself. The next days, he taught her to track, to read the story of hoofprints in the dust, to see how a bent blade of grass meant movement, how scat told you not just what animal passed, but when. She stumbled, misread signs, grew frustrated. Jax didn't coddle her. His corrections were curt, sometimes harsh, but she learned. Then came the knife. He placed the blade in her hand, the same one he'd used to pry open her shackle. Her grip was clumsy at first, her swings wild. Jax corrected her stance, adjusted her wrist, forced her to repeat until her arm trembled from the weight. Fast and close, he said. Never give him the chance to see it coming. And if you strike, you finish. She hated that part. He could see it in the tightness of her jaw, the way her stomach turned when he spoke of killing as plain survival. But she didn't walk away. She listened. She practiced. At night, after hours of training, she sat by the fire, silent, staring into the flames. Jax knew the look. It was the moment when the line between who you were and who you had to become started to blur, and he knew there was no going back for her now. Weeks slipped by. Ilara grew stronger. Her steps grew quieter, her eyes sharper. She was still green, still carried the weight of grief heavy on her shoulders, but she no longer looked like the girl he'd found chained to a wheel. She was changing. One evening, after a day of practice, she brought down her first rabbit with a bow Jax had fashioned. She carried it back proudly, her chin lifted. Jax said nothing, but he saw the way she glowed inside, and he knew. This was the start of something neither of them could walk away from, but change never comes without a price. On the 12th night, as they camped beneath the broken moon, Ilara sat in silence for a long time before speaking. Her voice was low, almost trembling, but steady at its core. "My family," she said. "They're not gone. Not all of them. Some escaped. They ran. To Dusthaven. That's where they'll go next, Jax. The raiders. If we don't stop them." Her words hung heavy in the air. Jax closed his eyes, feeling the weight settle on his chest. He knew the truth already. He'd seen the signs. He'd heard the rumors of a warband growing bold, but hearing it from her made it real. And once again, he found himself at a crossroads he'd sworn he'd never face again. He could leave, ride out before dawn, vanish into the Badlands, let the town fend for itself, or he could stay, fight, bind himself to this girl and her cause, and in doing so, dig his own grave a little deeper. Ilara's eyes met his, burning with the same defiance she'd had even in chains. "Help me," she said. "Please." Jax didn't answer. Not yet. But the firelight caught the scar on his jaw, and in its flicker, the outlaw looked less like a drifter and more like the man he used to be. The desert gave its lessons slow, and each one left scars. By the second week, Ilara could walk the rocky gullies without stumbling, her feet finding silence where once they kicked stones loose. She could start a fire in minutes, her hands quick, unpracticed, the frustration of those first failed sparks now a memory. She could track the passage of deer, rabbit, and even man across the hardpan, reading the signs as though the earth itself whispered to her. But Jax knew skill without blood was only half a lesson, and the desert wasn't kind enough to let a person stay half-learned for long. It came to a head one morning when they rode out together, following the dry bed of a creek that cut between red stone cliffs. The air was sharp with the promise of rain far away, rain that would never reach them. Jax dismounted, crouching low to the ground. "Tracks," he said, pointing to the faint scuff marks pressed into the dust. "Small, heavy, wild hog, maybe two of them." Ilara knelt beside him, studying. Her brow furrowed, her lips moving silently as she traced the prints with her eyes. Heading west, not more than an hour ahead, Jax gave a small grunt. "Good eye." He straightened, brushing dust from his knees. "Hogs'll keep you fed. Mean bastards, though, won't run from you like rabbit. They'll turn, and when they do, they'll come fast." Ilara swallowed but nodded. She tightened her grip on the bow slung across her shoulder. They tracked the prints into a narrow ravine where mesquite grew thick. The air buzzed with flies, the ground torn where snouts had rooted. Jax motioned for her to stop. Ahead, the brush shook. A low grunt rolled through the stillness. The boar emerged like a shadow ripped from the earth, broad, bristled, tusks curved wickedly. Its small eyes burned with feral malice. It pawed the ground, snorted, and lowered its head. Alara froze. The bowstring dug into her fingers, but her hands trembled. Steady, Jax whispered behind her. Breathe deep. Aim low, behind the shoulder. The boar charged. Alara loosed the arrow. It flew wild, slicing past the beast's flank. The hog barreled forward, tusks flashing. Jax shoved her aside and stepped into its path. His knife flashed in a blur of steel. One strike, then another. Quick, precise. The hog squealed, thrashing, then collapsed in a heap of dust and blood. Alara scrambled to her feet, heart pounding. She stared at the carcass, her chest heaving. You hesitated, Jax said flatly, wiping his blade on his coat. Could've been the end of you. I tried, she snapped, her voice breaking. I couldn't, he cut her off. Trying don't keep you alive. Doing does. Her hands curled into fists. She turned from him, blinking hard, fighting the sting in her eyes. The sight of blood pooled on the ground, clawed at her insides. She wanted to retch. She wanted to run. But more than anything, she wanted not to feel helpless again. Again, she whispered. Jax raised a brow. What? Again, she said, louder, her jaw set. I won't fail twice. For a long moment, he studied her. Then he gave a short nod. All right. Again. That evening, they roasted the hog's meat over a low fire. Jax skinned it clean, showing her how to strip the hide, how to save the fat, how to use every piece. Waste nothing, he told her. Out here, every scrap's the difference between living and starving. Alara listened, silent, her hands moving where he directed. The stench of blood clung to her, the memory of the boar's eyes still burning in her head. But she forced herself through it. When the meat was done, Jax handed her the first piece. She chewed slowly, tasting more than just food, tasting survival, the cost of it. That night she didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the stars, the sound of the boar's squeal echoing in her mind. Jax kept watch nearby, silent as stone. He didn't comfort her, didn't say it would get easier. He knew it wouldn't. But when the dawn came, she rose with the same fire in her eyes as before. The days that followed hardened her. Jax pushed her relentlessly. He set snares and made her find them. He laid false tracks and forced her to hunt him through canyons. When she failed, he made her start again. When she faltered, he reminded her of the hog's charge, of what hesitation cost. At first, anger fueled her. She cursed him under her breath, muttered that he was cruel, that he wanted her broken. He ignored it, knowing anger was better than fear. And slowly, anger turned into something sharper. Focus. By the third week, she moved like someone who belonged to the desert. She could strike a spark in the dark without fumbling, skin a rabbit in minutes, climb rock faces with sure hands. Her bow no longer wavered when she drew it. Her knife no longer shook when she practiced strikes against the post Jax had carved. Still, there was one lesson she hadn't faced, and Jax knew it was coming. It came sooner than he liked. They were 2 valleys over when they found the camp, a pair of raiders, drunk and careless, their horses tied nearby. Jax spotted them first, crouching low, signaling Alara to follow. They crept close enough to see the glint of blades, the red tattoos scrawled on the men's necks. Ilara's breath hitched. She recognized the markings, the same warband that had burned her home. Her hand went to her knife, trembling with rage. Jax caught her wrist, holding it firm. Not yet, he whispered. Her eyes blazed at him, fury and desperation. They were. There, I saw them. They chained me. I know, Jack said. His grip stayed iron. But anger makes you sloppy. You want revenge? You take it clean, silent, no mistakes. He let go. Slowly, deliberately, he pointed at the smaller of the two raiders, the one who'd slumped against a rock, half asleep, his pistol loose in his lap. This one's yours. Ilara's breath quickened. Her pulse roared in her ears. She crouched, moving through brush the way Jax had drilled her. Every step felt heavier than stone. She reached the man, knife drawn. Her hands shook. The memory of the hog came back. The charge, the blood, the failure. She saw her mother's face, her father's last stand, and she pressed the blade hard against his throat. The raider stirred, eyes fluttering open in confusion. He tried to speak. He never got the chance. Ilara drove the knife home. Hot blood spilled over her hands. The raider gasped, choked, and went still. She stumbled back, her breath ragged. Her stomach lurched. She dropped to her knees, trembling, fighting the urge to vomit. Jax appeared beside her, calm as ever. He wiped the blade clean, then pressed it back into her hand. "Now you've learned," he said. She looked at him with wide, haunted eyes. "Learned what?" "That you can." The second raider never saw the end coming. Jax took care of him with a quick shot, the gun muffled in his coat. By the time Ilara steadied herself, both men lay still. They stripped the camp, took food, ammunition, and maps. One scrap of parchment marked with charcoal lines caught Jax's eye. Trails, supply points, and a circle drawn around a name. Dust Haven. He folded the map, sliding it into his coat. His face was unreadable, but inside, he knew the road was laid. Ilara, wiping her blood-stained hands on the dirt, whispered, "They're going there. To Dust Haven." Jax looked at her, really looked. She wasn't the chained girl anymore. Her hands still shook, her face still pale, but something had shifted. She'd crossed a line. "Then we'll be there first," he said. And in the desert silence, under the shadow of death, their war began. The desert was wide enough to bury 1,000 secrets, but shadows didn't stay hidden forever. Not when men like the warband carved scars across the land. Jax and Ilara moved at the edges of those scars, never too close, never too far. The raiders left trails of smoke and ash behind them, and where the smoke thinned, the pair followed like wolves stalking a herd. They camped in high places, watched from ridgelines, marked every turn of the enemy's path. The warband was bigger than Ilara had feared, at least 30 hardened killers, their faces marked with ink and firebrands, their laughter sharp as broken glass. They rode with wagons rattling full of stolen rifles, crates of powder, food looted. From settlements too weak to resist, from their vantage, Jax's voice was low and steady. "They're building toward something. Ain't just a raid. They're supplying for war." Ilara lay beside him in the dust, her eyes fixed on the distant fires. Dust Haven. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Days turned into weeks, and the shadowing became a kind of rhythm. At dawn they studied tracks. By noon they rode hard to keep pace. At night they crouched on hillsides, watching the warband's campfires flare against the dark. Jax taught her to read the enemies. Habits, which men stood guard and which slipped away to sleep, where the wagons settled in the circle, how the horses were tied, which ones were restless, which ones were strong. He made her memorize every detail, every weakness. "Information's the first weapon," he told her one night, tracing patterns in the sand with a stick. "You know where a man eats, sleeps, and shits. You got him cornered without ever drawing steel." Ilara listened, her jaw tight, her fingers clutching the knife at her belt. She thought of her family, of the chains, of the smoke that had devoured her home. The faces of the raiders were burned into her memory, but now they were no longer demons. In the dark, They were flesh and blood, vulnerable, mortal. It was a dangerous knowledge, and she drank it like water. Their first strike came by chance. They'd tracked the warband to a canyon where the raiders had paused to water their horses. Jax and Ilara perched on a ridge above, watching dust swirl below. Jax's eyes narrowed. A small group of raiders, 4 men, broke away from the camp, driving 2 pack horses laden with sacks of grain and powder kegs. "Supply run," he muttered. "If those kegs make it to Dust Haven, the town's gone." Ilara's pulse quickened. She followed his gaze, then met his eyes. "We can take them." He studied her, weighing her readiness. The knife at her belt wasn't trembling anymore. Her bow lay across her lap, the string taut beneath her fingers. "You're sure?" "Yes." He gave a single nod. "Then we move." The ambush was simple, cruel, and effective. They waited in a narrow defile where the canyon path pinched tight between boulders. Jax rigged loose stones above with a rope snare, while Ilara crouched low with her bow. The sun beat down hard, baking the stone, but neither moved, neither breathed more than a whisper. The riders came. Dust kicked beneath hooves. Voices echoed off stone. Jax tugged the rope. The boulders tumbled with thunder, slamming into the path. The horses reared, screaming. Raiders cursed, scrambling for weapons. Ilara loosed her first arrow. It struck a man clean through the throat, dropping him before his pistol cleared leather. Another raider raised his rifle, but Jax was already there, bursting from cover with a shotgun's roar. The blast tore him off his feet. The fight was brutal and quick. Ilara killed again, her knife finding a man's ribs when he lunged at her. She felt the gyve of flesh, the hot rush of blood, but she did not falter. Not this time. When the dust cleared, 4 bodies lay scattered across the path. The pack horses stamped nervously, their loads still intact. Ilara stood panting, her blade slick, her eyes wide with something fierce and new. Not fear, not anymore. Jax wiped his shotgun clean, glancing at her. "You didn't freeze." She shook her head. "I couldn't, not with Dust Haven at stake." A rare flicker of approval touched his scarred face. "Good. Then you're learning." They stripped the bodies, set the horses loose, and smashed the powder kegs against the rocks, scattering black dust into the wind. No supplies would reach the warband that day, but Jax knew the cost of shadows. Kill a raider, and the others would notice. And when they noticed, they'd start hunting back. The next nights were restless. The warband grew wary, their patrols wider, their fires burning lower. Jax and Ilara kept farther back, moving camp every few hours. The game had changed. They weren't watchers anymore. They were ghosts, gnawing at the edges of a beast too big to bite clean through. Yet with every strike, Ilara hardened. She no longer flinched at the weight of her knife. She no longer hesitated to notch an arrow. Her movements grew precise, her decisions sharp. Jax saw it and felt a quiet unease. She was no longer the girl he'd cut from chains. She was something else now, something forged by pain and sharpened by vengeance. He'd meant to make her strong. He wondered if he was making her dangerous. Their second strike came at night. They crept into the warband's outer camp while the moon rode high. Raiders slept in scattered clusters, their snores rumbling like beasts in a den. Jax moved silent as shadow, laying strips of oil-soaked cloth near the supply wagons. Ilara followed, clutching a lit coal in a small clay pot. When the signal came, she dropped the ember onto the cloth. Fire whooshed to life, racing in orange veins across the ground. The wagons erupted in flame, the powder inside catching with a roar that shook the canyon. Chaos ripped the camp apart. Raiders shouted, horses screamed, shadows stumbled in panic. Jax and Ilara slipped away into the night, the blaze lighting their escape. Behind them, the warband howled in fury, their supplies gone to smoke and ash. By dawn, the desert was alive with their anger. Scouts ranged wide, searching. Jax and Alara lay hidden in a dry creek bed, listening to hoofbeats thunder past. Alara's heart hammered, but she smiled, an expression sharp as a blade. "We hurt them." Jax watched her, his face unreadable. "We did, but deep down, he knew they'd only poked the hornet's nest." On the third week, they found proof, another map, stolen from a dead raider. This one was clearer, marked with dates and routes. The warband wasn't just raiding, they were staging. Dusthaven wasn't their end, it was their beginning. From there, they meant to sweep the whole borderland in fire. Alara stared at the map, her hands trembling not with fear, but with fury. "We have to stop them before they get there." Jax folded the parchment slowly, his mind working like a whetstone on steel. "We can't fight 30 men head-on. We bleed them, one cut at a time, break their spirit, make them think death walks beside them. And then? Then we finish it in Dusthaven, where it all comes together." The days that followed blurred into fire and shadow. They cut loose horses in the night, scattering the herd across the desert. They poisoned water barrels with cactus pulp, sickening men for days. They rigged canyons with rockfalls, bringing down death from above. Each strike was a whisper of vengeance, a reminder that the desert had eyes, and with each strike, Alara grew sharper, faster, colder. She laughed when raiders cursed the shadows. She smiled when their fires burned low. Jax watched her transformation with a mix of pride and unease. He'd wanted her to survive. Now she wanted more than survival. She wanted retribution, down to the last drop. One night, as they crouched above another burning camp, she turned to him, her face lit by the glow. "When it's done," she said, "when every last one of them is gone, what then?" Jax didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, the memories of his own past killings heavy on his shoulders. "Then," he said at last, "you learn what it means to live with ghosts." By the time the warband limped closer to Dusthaven, they were half the force they had been. Supplies gone, horses scattered, nerves frayed. Every step toward the town was haunted by whispers of unseen hunters, and in the rocks above, Jax and Alara waited, shadows of the borderland ready for the final reckoning. Dusthaven was not a fortress. It was a collection of clapboard buildings gathered around a well, a few barns, a church with peeling white paint, and a crooked row of saloons and shops along a main street that turned to mud when the rains came. Its people were ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, tough in their own way but untrained, unarmed for the kind of storm that was coming. From the ridge that overlooked the town, Jax and Alara saw it all laid bare in the morning light. Smoke already curled on the horizon. The warband, coming at last. "They'll hit by sundown," Jax muttered, spitting into the dust. Alara's eyes scanned the town. Children playing near the well, a woman sweeping her porch, men unloading sacks of grain from a wagon. None of them knew the thunder that was about to break over their lives. Her jaw tightened. "Then we warn them. We prepare them." Jax gave a humorless chuckle. "Town like this, you shout raiders, half'll scatter, other half won't. Believe you, but we'll try." They rode in slow, not to spook folks. Dusthaven looked at them with suspicion. Strangers carried bad omens in the borderland. But when Jack swung down from his horse and called for the sheriff, people gathered anyway, curiosity outweighing fear. Sheriff Hollis came, a stout man with gray whiskers and weary eyes. He leaned on the rail outside his office, chewing a splinter of wood. "What's your business, stranger?" Jax's voice was flat, iron hard. "Your business, Sheriff. Warband's heading this way. 30 men, maybe less now, armed heavy. They'll be here before nightfall," the crowd muttered. A woman gasped. Hollis narrowed his eyes, studying Jax, then Alara, her bow slung, her expression carved from stone. "You've proof?" Jax tossed, a crumpled map into the dust at his boots. The sheriff bent, studied the markings, the routes, the supply notes scribbled in raider shorthand. His jaw worked. He looked up, his voice lower now. God help us. The town moved like a stirred anthill. Wagons rolled into barricades. Windows were shuttered, rifles dusted off, buckets of water drawn from the well and lined along the street. Jax walked the main road with Hollis, pointing where to dig firing pits, where to stack barrels for cover. His voice was steady, commanding, every word a shard of his old life surfacing. Ilara moved among the women and children, teaching those who could draw a bow how to hold, how to aim. She showed a boy no older than 12 how to notch an arrow without cutting his fingers. His hands shook, but hers did not. By sundown, Dusthaven had become something it had never been, a town braced for war. They came at dusk as the sun sank red behind the mesas. The warband rolled out of the desert like a storm front, dust rising around their horses, the rattle of wagon wheels like distant thunder. 30 had become closer to 20, but 20 hardened killers could still wipe a town from the earth. Their leader rode tall at the front, a scarred giant named Garrick, his face half burned, his voice carrying across the plain. Dusthaven, he roared. We take what we want, or we burn you to ash. The townsfolk huddled behind their barricades. Some clutched rifles with trembling hands, others whispered prayers. Ilara stood among them, her bow strung, her face set like flint. Jack stood in the center of the street, shotgun resting across his arm, his voice carrying back just as hard. You'll find no easy pickings here, Garrick. Turn back, or the desert'll drink your blood. Laughter rolled from the raiders, hard and cruel. Garrick raised his hand, and the warband surged forward. The siege began with fire. Flaming arrows arced over the barricades, clattering onto rooftops. Buckets of water hissed as townsfolk scrambled to douse sparks. Gunfire cracked, echoing down the street. Dust rose, smoke stung the eyes. Jax barked orders, steadying the line. Hold till you see their eyes. Don't waste powder. The first wave smashed against the barricades. Raiders leapt from horses, pistols blazing, machetes swinging. The townsfolk fired back, rifles bucking in nervous hands. One man fell screaming, another dropped with a bullet through his chest. Ilara's arrows found their marks, swift and unflinching. She shot a raider off his horse, dropped another as he tried to climb a barrel stack. Her hands moved like water, her face calm, even as chaos raged around her. Jax fought where the line bent hardest. His shotgun thundered, dropping men in sprays of blood and dust. When it emptied, he swung the barrel like a club, breaking teeth and bone. The warband pulled back, regrouped. Smoke hung over the street, screams rising with it. Dusthaven had held, for now. Night fell, but the siege did not end. The raiders circled, firing shots into the dark, whooping and howling like wolves. They probed for weakness, set small fires, tested the townsfolk's resolve. Jax paced the barricade, eyes sharp, mind grinding through every move. He'd been here before, small towns under siege, fear eating at men faster than bullets. Ilara crouched beside him, her bow across her knees. Her voice was quiet, but steady. They'll try to starve us. Break us down slow. Maybe, Jack said, but Garrick ain't patient. He wants blood. He'll come hard again at dawn. And at dawn, he did. The second assault came like a hammer. Raiders charged in a wedge, wagons rolling behind them as makeshift battering rams. Gunfire exploded, louder, closer. Barricades shuddered. Under the impact, Jax bellowed for the line to hold, his shotgun roaring until it clicked empty. He drew his revolver, firing quick and precise, each shot a death knell. Ilara was everywhere, on the rooftops, loosing arrows into the press, then dropping down to drive her knife into a raider's ribs when they breached the barricade. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair tangled, her eyes bright with a fierce light that frightened even her allies. The townsfolk fought like cornered wolves, men and women side by side, firing from windows, stabbing with pitchforks, throwing stones when bullets ran dry. The street was a cauldron of smoke, blood, and screams. Still, the warband pressed. Still, Garrick roared. It broke at midday. A wagon smashed through the barricade, spilling raiders into the street. The line wavered, townsfolk screaming, some fleeing toward the church. Dusthaven's defense teetered on the edge of ruin. Jack saw it. He knew if they broke here, it was over. He grabbed Alara's arm, dragging her close, his voice a growl over the din. We take the head. Garrick falls, they scatter. You with me? Her eyes blazed. To the end. Together, they plunged into the breach. The fight to Garrick was like charging into a storm. Raiders swarmed, pistols cracking, blades flashing. Jax's revolver spat fire, then ran dry. He swung it as a club, clearing space. Alara darted at his side, her knife flashing, her bow long since discarded. And then he was there, Garrick, towering. Over the carnage, his burned face twisted in a snarl. His axe came down in a brutal arc. Jax caught it on the barrel of his shotgun, sparks flying. The impact rattled his bones. They grappled, steel against steel, brute strength against raw grit. Garrick shoved him back, axe slicing the air. Jax staggered, blood running down his arm, but Alara was there. She leapt onto a wagon, drew an arrow from her quiver, and loosed at point-blank range. The shaft buried deep in Garrick's shoulder. He roared, swinging wildly. Jax seized the moment. With a roar of his own, he drove the broken stock of his shotgun into Garrick's throat. The giant staggered, choking. Alara leapt down, knife in hand, and together they drove him to the ground. Jax pinned his arms. Alara's blade flashed, sinking deep. Garrick shuddered once, then lay still. Silence rippled across the battlefield. Raiders froze, staring at their fallen leader. Jax rose slowly, bloodied, smoke curling around him. His voice carried like iron. Your warband's done. Run, or join him in the dust. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the first raider broke, bolting for his horse. Others followed, scattering into the desert, their fury crumbling into fear. Dusthaven was saved. When it was over, the town was a ruin of smoke and blood. Barricades broken, homes scorched, bodies, raider and townsfolk alike, lying in the dirt. The survivors moved among them in shock, weeping, tending the wounded, gathering the dead. Alara stood in the street, Garrick's blood still on her hands. Her chest heaved, her eyes wide. Victory burned in her veins, but so did something darker. Jax came to her side, his face lined with weariness. He laid a hand on her shoulder. It ain't over, he said softly. They'll be back, different. Faces, same fire. That's the borderland. She turned to him, her voice hoarse. Then we'll be ready. Dusthaven buried its dead at sunset. Bells tolled from the church, slow and heavy. Smoke drifted into the sky, carrying prayers with it. Jax watched from the edge of town, his scars aching, his soul heavy with ghosts. He had saved them, for now. But he knew the desert never stayed quiet long. Beside him, Alara stood tall, her bow across her back, her eyes set on the horizon. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a frightened girl. She was something else entirely now, something the borderland itself had forged, and together they waited for whatever shadows would rise next. The desert was quiet again, but it was not peace. Ash drifted in the air like black snow, settling on rooftops, on shattered barricades, on the still forms wrapped in sheets at the edge of town. Dusthaven had survived, but survival had teeth. It had chewed the town raw. By morning, the air smelled of burned wood, blood, and the metallic tang of gunpowder. The streets were smeared with tracks where the wounded had been dragged, where water had spilled in frantic attempts to kill the flames and the silence. The silence was heavy as stone. No children laughed near the well. No music came from the saloon. The people of Dusthaven moved like shadows, whispering, carrying shovels, carrying grief. Jack stood by the churchyard fence, his hat low, his coat torn and stained. He watched as the townsfolk dug graves in the hard-packed ground. The thud of shovels was steady, grim. Sheriff Hollis leaned on a spade, sweat and tears mixing on his weathered face. "Never thought I'd see it," he muttered. "We held. God help us. We held." Jax didn't answer. His gaze swept the dead, men who'd taken up rifles for the first time, women with scorched hands from carrying buckets to fight the fires, children who had hidden but never came out alive. Survival had a price, and the borderland never gave. Change. Ilara stood apart, arms crossed, her bow still slung on her back. She had blood on her hands. Not her own, not entirely. She had washed them again and again in the trough, but the stain lingered in her mind. She didn't flinch when the townsfolk looked at her, some with gratitude, some with unease. She had killed as many as Jax, maybe more. They knew it. And though they lived because of it, they were afraid of her. The burial came at sundown. The church bell tolled slow, each strike echoing across the desert. Names were read, voices breaking, candles flickered against the cooling wind. Jack stood at the back, his head bowed, though no prayers passed his lips. He had spoken too many over the years, over too many graves. The words felt hollow now. He let silence be his prayer. Ilara stood beside him, stiff, unaccustomed to the rituals of townsfolk. She listened, her sharp features softened by the candle glow. When the names ended, when the earth was patted flat over the last grave, she whispered, under her breath, something in her own tongue, older, raw. A prayer the desert might hear, if nothing else. Jax glanced at her but said nothing. Some things didn't need translation. That night, the saloon reopened, not for drink or laughter, but for gathering. The survivors crowded in, smoke-stung eyes, and bandaged arms, the air thick with sweat and fatigue. Sheriff Hollis spoke first. His voice was ragged but steady. "Dusthaven lives. We stood against them, and we sent 'em running. But it cost us. It'll cost us more if we don't stand together." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded, others scowled. An old rancher slammed his fist on the table. "You think this is done? Garrick's gone, but there'll be more. Always more. This ain't no place to live." A younger woman, her sleeve torn where a bullet had grazed her, shot back. "And where would you run?" "There's no safe place. Might as well fight here, where we got a well and walls." The argument swelled, voices clashing like blades. Fear, anger, grief, all of it boiling over. Jack sat in the corner, silent, his hands wrapped around a glass of untouched whiskey. Ilara leaned on the wall near him, her eyes watching, listening. Finally, a voice cut through. "What about them?" All eyes turned. A man pointed at Jax and Ilara. "They brought the fight here. Raiders were tracking them. Maybe it ain't Dusthaven they wanted at all." The room went still. Jax's jaw tightened. He didn't rise, didn't reach for his gun. His voice, when it came, was low but carried to every ear. "That warband would have taken Dusthaven whether we were here or not. Seen it before. You've got water, stock, land. That's blood to raiders. We didn't bring it. They smelled it." Ilara's eyes flashed, her voice sharp as an arrowhead. "We bled with you. Do you think they would have turned away if we weren't here? You'd all be ash by now." The man looked away, chastened, but the unease lingered. Gratitude warred with suspicion. Heroes in the borderland were always one step from monsters. When the meeting broke, Jax stepped out into the night. The desert air was cool, the stars sharp and cold. He lit a cigarette, the flame flaring against the dark. Ilara joined him, folding, her arms, looking out over the broken barricades. "They don't trust us." "They don't trust anyone," Jax said around the smoke. "Trust gets you killed out here." She was quiet a long moment. You've carried this before." He exhaled slow, watching the smoke drift. Too many times. Her eyes studied him. "Why stay, then? Why keep fighting for folks who look at you like a loaded gun?" Jax turned to her, his gaze hard. "Because if I walk away, they die. Simple as that. You fight for yourself, you live a little longer. You fight for others, maybe the world remembers you different." Ilara considered that, her jaw tightening. She had fought for survival her whole life. But fighting for others, that was new and dangerous. The next days were a blur of rebuilding. Barricades patched, roofs mended, wells cleared of ash. The people worked with desperation, knowing raiders could return any hour. Jax helped where he could, hammering nails, setting timbers. His scarred hands were steady, though every nail he drove reminded him of another town, another fight, another cycle that never ended. Ilara trained the youths. Her bow lessons turned into defense drills, her sharp voice cutting through their fear. "You miss once, you die. Aim again. No mercy in the desert." Some balked at her harshness, but others thrived. She watched them change, watched children's eyes harden into something else. It unsettled her. And yet, she kept teaching. At night, Jack sat by the forge with a whetstone, sharpening his blade, the rasp filling the silence. Ilara sat nearby, fletching arrows. They spoke little, but the bond between them deepened, not with words, but with shared scars. On the fifth night, the quiet broke. A rider stumbled into town, half dead, his horse lathered with foam. He collapsed in the street, gasping, "They're coming." More of them. Bigger, before the life left his eyes. The desert was stirring again. Dusthaven had barely survived the first siege, and now the shadow of another loomed. Jack stared down at the body, his fists clenched. He knew the price of survival. It was never paid once. It was a debt that always came due again. Ilara stepped beside him, her eyes fierce but unflinching. "Then we fight again." Jax nodded slowly. "Yeah, but this time, we don't just fight to survive. We fight to end it." The desert wind carried their words away, into the night. Dusthaven held its breath. The desert never slept. Wind stirred the ashes that still clung to Dusthaven's streets, whispering through broken timbers and shattered windows. The town had not yet healed from its wounds when the rider brought news of worse to come. Now every breath, every shadow, every distant hoofbeat set nerves on edge. Sheriff Hollis stood in the saloon, the map of the borderlands spread across the poker table. Lantern light threw sharp lines across his face. His hand trembled as he traced the northern ridges. "Scouts say they're massing up here, twice as many as before, maybe more. Garrick's death didn't scatter 'em. It united 'em. Raiders don't usually work together, but this lot smells blood." The townsfolk crowded. Close, their faces pinched with fear. Farmers with calloused hands, miners with soot still caked in their skin, wives clutching shawls. "Men too old to lift rifles." "They'll come hard," Hollis continued. "And they'll come soon. Dusthaven's still standing, but our walls won't hold a second siege." The room broke into mutters, arguments, curses. "We can't do it. Again. They'll slaughter us all. Best to scatter while we still can." Jax leaned in the corner, arms crossed, hat brim shadowing his eyes. He'd heard this before, in other towns, other places where people believed running was safer than standing. Running only made you easier to hunt. Ilara stood by the window, her bow slung across her back. She listened in silence, but her fingers flexed restlessly. She hated this talk of surrender. She had seen villages burn because no one believed they could fight. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "You can't run. If you scatter, they'll pick you off like rabbits. Your only chance is here, behind walls, with fire and steel in your hands." A rancher spat. "And what do you know of fighting, girl? Alara's eyes burned. I know. How raiders think. I know the scent of blood they follow. I know the way they circle, the way they wait until you're weak and afraid before they strike. I know because I was their prisoner once. The room went still. Eyes turned to her, wary, curious. Jax watched without surprise. He had suspected something like this, though Alara had never spoken of it aloud. They took my people, she said, her voice tight but steady. Chained us, burned us out, left us for crows. I learned their ways to survive. I escaped, but I never forgot. You think hiding will save you? Hiding only feeds them. The silence was heavy. Jax finally stepped forward. His voice graveled low. She's right. Fighting's the only chance you've got. But not straight on. They'll expect that. They'll break you like dry sticks if you meet 'em head on. He pointed at the map. We don't fight here in town. We take the fight. Out there, where the desert's on our side. By dawn, the plan was set. Not everyone agreed. Some packed wagons and slipped away before sunrise, too scared to gamble their lives on Jax's word. Hollis cursed, but let them go. Better a smaller band of the willing than a crowd of cowards breaking in the heat of battle. The rest, the stubborn, the desperate, the damned, prepared. Jax led a small group into the ridges, setting traps where the canyon narrowed, where boulders could be rolled loose with a shove. He showed them how to rig deadfalls with rope and oil-soaked brush, how to place mirrors to flash signals from ridge to ridge. Alara took the younger ones, teaching them ambush tactics, how to lie still for hours, how to strike and vanish, how to put fear in the enemy's heart by making the land itself hostile. Dusthaven was no longer a town. It had become a battlefield. The warband came at sunset 3 days later. From the ridges, Dusthaven's sentries saw the dust cloud first, a rising storm of riders, wagons, and fire. Their numbers filled the horizon, torches glowing like a line of hellfire. Sheriff Hollis stood on the wall, rifle clenched tight, his throat dry. Lord above! Jax climbed the ladder and looked out. His expression didn't change, though his jaw worked tight. Bigger than I reckoned? 40, 50 riders at least. They've got a ram, too. Alara's breath hitched at the sight, though her hands were steady as she strung her bow. We can't face that straight on. Jax's eyes narrowed. We won't. Time to bleed 'em before they reach the gate. The first strike came in the narrows. As the raiders funneled through, a thunderclap shook the canyon. Boulders tumbled, smashing into riders and horses. Dust choked the air. Screams split the dusk. Then arrows rained from hidden ledges. Alara's shots found eyes and throats, each draw smooth, each release like she was carving justice into the world. The raiders panicked, wheeling, cursing, firing blindly into the rocks. Shadows moved, vanished, struck again. For every raider cut down, fear spread twice as fast. But the warband didn't break. They regrouped, pushed through, dragging the ram forward. Bloodied but not beaten, they pressed toward Dusthaven. By nightfall, fire painted the desert red. The raiders circled, testing the walls, probing with small charges. Their drums beat low, echoing like thunder. Dusthaven's defenders held, arrows and rifles flashing in the dark. Every attack was repelled, but each one cost powder, arrows, strength. Alara crouched beside Jax on the wall, loosing arrow after arrow until her fingers bled. They won't stop, she hissed. They don't need to, Jax growled, firing his repeater into the night. They've got more men than we've got bullets. They just need to outlast us. She glanced at him, sweat streaking her face. Then what do we do? Jax's eyes fixed on the ram moving in the shadows, carried by brute force toward the gate. His face hardened. We cut the head off. Take out their leader. Scatter the rest. Alara followed his gaze to a tall rider barking orders, silhouetted against torchlight. Her stomach clenched. He's armored. Too far for me. Jax chambered another round, his voice like steel. Then I'll get closer. The night deepened, the battle raging like wildfire. Dusthaven shook under the weight of survival's cost. The warband had returned, and this time, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Jack slipped into the darkness beyond the wall, knife in hand, moving like a shadow toward the heart of the storm. Alara watched him vanish, her chest tight. She knocked another arrow, lifted her chin and whispered, "Don't die out there, outlaw." The desert drums beat on, and the warband roared. The desert roared with war. Dusthaven's walls shuddered beneath the pounding of the ram, each blow splintering timber, shaking stone, rattling the marrow of every soul inside. Torches flared against the night, casting monstrous shadows of raiders clambering over the barricades. Rifle shots cracked, arrows sang, and screams carried high into the black sky. Amid the chaos, Jax slipped into the dark. He moved low, hugging the ground, keeping the blaze of torches to his back. He'd done this dance before, in border skirmishes, in outlaw raids, in half a dozen towns that thought law could hold the wild at bay. Shadows were his old friends. Silence was his old teacher. Ahead, the warband's heart beat loud, a knot of riders circling their ram, drums pounding a savage rhythm, and in the center, a tall figure astride a black horse, barking orders. The man wore a breastplate hammered from scavenged iron, crude but effective, with a wolf's skull mounted on his helm. His voice carried above the din, sharp as a whip. "The gate falls tonight. Drive them down. Burn it clean." Jax narrowed. His eyes. That was the one. The warband's spine. Cut him out, and the rest might break. He checked the knife at his hip, the revolver at his belt. He had 6 rounds, no more. Enough, if he was lucky. Not enough, if he wasn't. Back on the wall, Alara loosed arrow after arrow into the mass. Her arms ached, her fingers blistered raw, but she refused to stop. She saw Jax's shadow vanish into the dark and felt a pang she couldn't name. Fear, yes, but something more. A raider scaled the ladder with a hooked blade, snarling. Alara's arrow took him in the throat before he could cry out. She kicked his body back down, panting, then turned to Hollis. "He's going for the leader." The sheriff spat blood, reloading with trembling hands. "Then pray to God he finds him before they find our gate." Jax crawled closer, slipping. Between wagons piled with loot, horses tethered and stamping in fear of the gunfire. He could smell sweat, leather, the iron tang of blood. He could see the leader now, close enough to mark the scars on his cheek, the cruel set of his mouth. 2 guards flanked him, rifles ready, eyes sharp. Jax waited, heart steady, breath slow. He counted the beats of the drum, the rhythm of the chaos. On the 3rd strike, he moved. He came from the blind side, knife flashing. The first guard never made a sound. Steel punched into his ribs, twisted, silenced. The second turned, eyes wide, mouth opening to shout. Jax's revolver cracked once, the muzzle flash blinding in the dark. The man dropped like a sack. The leader spun, drawing a curved saber, his horse rearing. "Who?" Jax was already moving. He lunged, slashing upward, sparks flying as his knife glanced off iron. The saber came down, grazing his shoulder, a burning line of pain. Jax gritted his teeth, shoved forward, ramming his knife toward the man's throat. The leader caught his wrist, snarling. His strength was brutal, arms like iron bands. "You think you can kill me, rat?" he roared. "I am Varric." "The desert bends to me," Jax's lip curled. "Then let's see if it bleeds." He smashed his forehead into Varric's helm, the crack ringing in his skull. The grip faltered. Jax twisted free, shoved the revolver under the iron plate, and pulled the trigger. The shot thundered. Varric jerked, eyes wide, blood spilling hot. For a heartbeat, he didn't fall. Then his saber slipped from his hand, and he toppled from the saddle, hitting the sand with a hollow thud. The drums faltered. Riders turned, voices rising in confusion. "The chief!" someone cried. "Varric's down!" Panic rippled like wildfire. The warband's formation wavered. Men shouted, some breaking ranks, others pressing forward blindly. Jack staggered back, blood soaking his sleeve, vision swimming. He holstered the revolver, clenched his teeth, and forced himself to vanish into the dark before the raiders could rally. On the wall, Alara saw it, the confusion, the faltering lines. She didn't know what Jax had done, but she felt it like a shift in the wind. "Now!" she shouted. "Push them now!" Hollis bellowed orders, and Dusthaven's defenders roared. Rifles cracked in furious rhythm, torches hurled down to ignite oil-soaked brush. Arrows rained, finding panicked targets as the warband stumbled without their spine. The ram, half-dragged to the gate, was abandoned. Raiders scattered, some fleeing into the desert, others fighting each other in the chaos of broken command. For the first time that night, the tide turned. Jax limped back through the smoke, his shirt slick with blood, his steps uneven but unbroken. He reached the base of the wall, just as Alara came down from the battlements, bow still in hand, face streaked with ash. When she saw him, her breath caught. "You!" She ran to him, catching his arm before he could stumble. "You did it!" He gave a tired half-smile, eyes dull with exhaustion. "Cut the head. Body's thrashing now." She eased him onto a bench, tearing cloth from her tunic to press against his wound. He hissed, but didn't pull away. "You're insane," she whispered, her hands steady even as her heart raced. "Maybe," he muttered, but it worked. The drums had gone silent. Out beyond the walls, the desert swallowed the retreating raiders. Dusthaven stood, battered, bloodied, but standing. For tonight, they had won. But victory tasted like smoke and copper. Inside the saloon-turned hospital, bodies were laid out. Friends, neighbors, kin. The moans of the wounded mixed with the wails of the grieving. Hollis walked the rows with hollow eyes, his badge tarnished, his hands trembling. "They'll call us heroes," he muttered to Alara, though his voice held no pride. "But heroes don't bleed like this." She glanced at Jax, half-conscious, on a cot, his chest rising and falling shallow but steady. Her jaw tightened. "No," she said softly. "Heroes don't, but survivors do." And in her heart, she knew the warband wasn't finished. Varric might be dead, but men like him had. Lieutenants, brothers, vultures waiting to rise. The desert was not done with them. Not yet. Morning crawled into Dusthaven like a thief. Pale light creeping over walls blackened by fire and alleys littered with the debris of war. The desert air, usually so crisp at dawn, carried only the sour tang of smoke and blood. The battle was over, but peace had not returned. Alara moved among the bodies with a band of weary townsfolk, the hem of her tunic stiff with dried blood. Some she recognized, faces that had greeted her with nods in the marketplace, men and women who'd once laughed in the saloon or traded goods in the square. Now they lay still, eyes glassy, skin waxen. She closed each pair of eyes with trembling, fingers murmuring the same quiet prayer. The dead far outnumbered the living. On the walls, Sheriff Hollis leaned heavily on his rifle like it was a crutch. He looked older than he had the night before, lines etched deeper into his weathered face. His badge caught the light, tarnished, cracked, almost mocking in its gleam. 37 gone, he muttered when Alara climbed the steps to stand beside him. His voice was hoarse, hollow. Half of 'em children or too old to hold a gun. The rest, good folk, damn good folk. Ilara's throat tightened. She wanted to offer him some word of comfort, some balm for the guilt clawing through him, but none came. All she could say was the truth. They'd all be dead if not for him. Hollis followed her gaze. Below, in the shade of the saloon-turned hospital, Jax sat slumped against the wall. His shirt was open, his shoulder wrapped in stained bandages, his revolver resting across his lap. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were sharp, scanning every face that passed, like a man waiting for the other boot to fall. The outlaw didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. By mid-morning, Dusthaven gathered. In the square, Survivors clung to one another, huddled in silence as the council tried to find words to meet the moment. A preacher, pale and trembling, raised his voice. "The Lord spared us, though we have bled. Let us honor those who fell." But the crowd wasn't listening. Their eyes were fixed on Jax, who stood at the edge, leaning heavily on Alara's arm. Whispers spread like brush fire. "That's him, the outlaw. He killed their chief, or brought them here in the first place. You think he ain't just another raider playing both sides?" Jax heard every word, though he gave no sign. He'd lived his life on the edge of towns like this, always the shadow, always the suspect. He knew how fast gratitude turned to suspicion when folk needed a scapegoat. Alara felt the weight of it too. She squared her shoulders, lifting her voice above the murmurs. "You saw what he did. You saw him bleed for us. Without him, Dusthaven would be ash." For a moment, silence hung heavy. But it wasn't enough. Too many eyes still burned with fear, with doubt. Hollis stepped forward, badge catching the sun. "She's right. I don't care if he's an outlaw, a saint, or the devil himself. He saved this town. That's fact." The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between relief and suspicion, gratitude and grief. Jax's gaze swept over them all, mothers clutching children, farmers with soot on their hands, old men too tired to spit. He saw what they couldn't say out loud. They didn't want a hero. They wanted someone to blame. He spat blood into the dust and muttered, "Gratitude don't last long in places like this." That night, Dusthaven lit funeral pyres. Flames licked the sky, sparks rising like souls carried into the heavens. The whole town gathered to watch, their faces lit orange, their eyes hollow. Alara stood beside Jax at the edge of the firelight. His arm brushed hers, heavy with weariness, but steady. "You've seen this before," she whispered. "Too many times," he said. His eyes reflected the fire, but showed no tears. "Every raid leaves ghosts. They stick to you. Don't matter how far you run." Alara turned her face to him, studying the lines of his jaw, the wear etched into his skin. "You carry ghosts." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Darlin', I'm made of 'em." The silence between them stretched, filled by the crackle of flames and the low hum of mourning songs. Alara reached for his hand, not boldly, but steady, like she'd already decided it wasn't a question. For a moment, his fingers twitched as if to pull away. Then he let them settle against hers, rough calluses brushing her palm. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. In the days that followed, Dusthaven tried to stitch itself back together. Walls were rebuilt, graves dug, food rationed. The town moved like a wounded animal, limping but alive. But the smoke hadn't cleared entirely. Scouts reported raider bodies found in the dunes, stripped and left by their own. Others whispered of campfires burning farther out in the desert. The warband was broken, yes, but not gone. And inside the town, whispers turned sharper. Varric's dead, but for how long? What if his lieutenants come? Wasn't there a bounty on that outlaw's head? One evening, Hollis found Jax outside the smithy, tightening the bandage on his shoulder. The sheriff scratched his jaw, eyes darting. "Word is, the governor's men are riding this way, hearing of the raid. They'll ask questions, and they won't take kindly to finding a wanted man being called a savior." Jax snorted. "Didn't figure they would." "You got a choice," Hollis said quietly. "Stay, and you'll hang. Leave, and maybe the town forgets you ever passed through. Either way, don't be here when the law comes knocking." Alara overheard, her chest tightening like a vice. She stepped forward. "You can't just drive him out. He fought for us." Hollis's eyes were heavy with sorrow. "He fought, aye. But Dusthaven ain't strong enough to stand against raiders and the law both. You want the town to survive? Sometimes you sacrifice what you want most." He walked away, leaving silence in his wake. Alara turned to Jax, her eyes fierce. "You don't have to go. But Jax only looked past her, toward the desert horizon where the fires of new camps burned faint against the night. "Ain't about want," he said. "It's about the ghosts that follow me. And they're still out there." That night, Alara dreamed of fire. Only this time, Dusthaven burned not from raiders, but from within. She woke before dawn, sweat on her skin, and found Jax already, saddled, his horse restless in the cool air. "You were just going to ride off?" she demanded, voice breaking. He adjusted his reins, not meeting her eyes. "Best way. Clean cut." She stepped forward, fury and sorrow battling in her chest. "After everything, after teaching me, after fighting for us, you'd just leave me here to pick up the pieces alone?" Finally, he looked at her. His eyes, weary and haunted, held something else too, something fragile, something unspoken. "You don't belong in the smoke I drag behind me, Alara," he said softly. "You deserve clear skies." Her hand trembled as it rose, resting against his chest. "Maybe I don't care about clear skies. Maybe I care about the man who walked into the fire with me." For a heartbeat, the desert held still. Then Jax reached down, clasping her wrist, his touch firm, but not unkind. "Then you best be ready," he murmured. "'Cause the war ain't over, and the next fight, it'll be worse." Alara's jaw set, her eyes steady. "Then I'll be ready." The first rays of dawn broke across the desert as they stood there, outlaw and survivor, bound not by blood or law, but by fire and ghosts. And beyond the horizon, the warband's remnants gathered like vultures. The smoke was not done rising. The desert carried sound in strange ways. Some mornings it was nothing but silence. The hush of sand shifting under the wind, the whisper of heat waiting to rise. Other mornings it carried the echo of hoofbeats long before riders appeared. This morning, Dusthaven heard them. A dozen men rode hard into town as the sun rose, their silhouettes black against the dawn. Dusthaven's folk stopped their work, tools clattering against the earth, heads lifting with that peculiar blend of hope and dread. These weren't raiders, at least not dressed like it. Their coats were long, their rifles polished, their hats marked with the insignia of the governor's riders, soldiers, lawmen, bringers of order, or so they claimed. Sheriff Hollis was waiting on the steps of the town hall, hat in his hand, shoulders set with the grim weight of a man who knew what was coming. The lead rider, a tall figure with a scar down his cheek, dismounted and strode forward with the cold certainty of someone used to being obeyed. "Sheriff Hollis," he said, voice sharp as steel. "Captain Darius Kane, governor's man out," of Calverton. Hollis inclined his head, though he didn't bow. "Dusthaven welcomes the governor's riders. Does it?" Kane's eyes flicked past Hollis, sweeping the battered town, the patched walls, the burned-out homes, the weary survivors. His lip curled faintly, not in pity, but in judgment. "I heard whispers of a raid. I see now they were no whispers." Hollis tightened his grip on his hat. "The town fought, held the line. And yet I see the smoke still hanging over you," Kane said. His gaze hardened. "And I hear talk that the man who led your defense is no sheriff, no soldier, but an outlaw, Jax Valen." The name hit the square like a bullet. Folk shifted, eyes darting, whispers hissing like snakes in the dust. Kane turned his head slowly, scanning the crowd. "Bring him forward." Jax was in the smithy, hammer in hand, when the soldiers came for him. He'd been working quietly, driving out the last of the pain in his shoulder through the ringing of iron on steel. The sound of boots behind him made him pause. "You Jax Valen?" one soldier demanded. Jax set the hammer down, turned slow, and let his eyes meet theirs. "Depends who's asking." "Governor's riders. Captain Kane wants a word." Jax smirked, though it didn't touch his eyes. "Figure he does." They marched him into the square, the whole town watching. Alara pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. She caught Jax's arm before they shoved him forward, her fingers gripping tight. "You don't have to bow to them," she whispered fiercely. Jax's voice was low, steady, almost tired. Ain't about bowing, it's about standing long. Enough to know what's comin'. Then he stepped into the open, where Kane stood waiting like a hangman at the gallows. Captain Kane looked Jax up and down, eyes sharp as knives. So, the butcher of Carrion Ridge lives. A ripple of shock swept the crowd. Alara frowned, glancing at Hollis. Carrion Ridge, she mouthed. The sheriff's jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the ground. Jax didn't flinch. That what they call it now? That's what the governor calls it. Kane circled him slowly, like a wolf testing its prey. 3 years passed. A gang of raiders wiped out an entire settlement. Burned homes, slaughtered families. The governor's men arrived, too late to stop it, but not too late to find the butcher's mark carved into the beams. Valen's mark. Alara's chest clenched. That's a lie. Kane's eyes snapped to her, sharp and cold. And who are you? I was there when Jax saved this town, she said, voice rising despite the fear clawing her throat. He fought for us. He bled for us. He's no butcher. Kane sneered faintly. The guilty always find someone to vouch for them. He turned back to Jax, voice cutting through the murmurs. By order of the governor, you stand accused of massacre, theft and murder. You will ride with us to Calverton, where you will hang. The square fell silent, all eyes fixed on Jax. He spat in the dirt. If you think I'm riding anywhere in chains, you don't know me. The soldiers tensed, rifles half lifted. Hollis stepped forward, voice urgent. Captain Kane, hold. He may be an outlaw, but he saved Dusthaven. Without him, none of us would be standing here. Kane didn't blink. Then perhaps you should thank him while you can. That night, they locked Jax in the old storehouse, 2 guards at the door. Alara wasn't allowed near him, though she tried. Instead, she found herself pacing the length of her home, hands trembling, heart torn in half. Sheriff Hollis came to her after sundown, his face shadowed, his voice low. Alara, he said gently, you need to let him go. She spun on him, eyes burning. Let him go? To hang for something he didn't do? You don't know that. Hollis's voice cracked. I've known Jax longer than you. There's blood on his hands, and not all of it raiders. You don't walk his path, without leaving graves behind. Ilara's hands shook, but her voice was steady. Maybe. But I know the man who stood with us. I know the man who taught me to fight, who fought when he could have run. That man isn't the butcher they say he is. Hollis looked at her a long time, pain in his eyes. Then he said the words she dreaded. If you try to stop this, you'll go down with him. In the storehouse, Jax sat in the shadows, listening to the muffled voices of his guards. His wrists were bound, but loosely. He could have slipped them if he wanted. Broken necks, vanished into the night. He'd done it before. But something kept him still. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him. Not as a monster. Not as a legend whispered in fear, but as a man worth saving. Alara. Her face rose in his mind, fierce and unyielding, her hand gripping his like she'd hold him to the earth if it split beneath him. The hangman's shadow stretched long, but for once, he didn't know if he wanted to run from it. The next morning, Dusthaven gathered once more. The riders prepared their prisoner for the road. Jax was dragged into the square, wrists bound, head high. Alara forced her way through the crowd, breath ragged, eyes blazing. She wasn't going to watch him vanish into chains and silence. "Stop!" she cried, stepping in front of Kane's men. "You can't do this!" Kane's gaze hardened. "Stand aside." "I won't." Her voice rang clear across the square. "You're wrong about him, and if you take him, you'll have to take me too." The square held its breath. Kane's lip curled. "Then perhaps the hangman will have too." But before he could give the order, a shout rang from the walls. "Riders! East Ridge!" The cry shattered the moment. Dusthaven's folk turned, panic rising. Out beyond the horizon, dust plumes rose once more. The warband. Kane's eyes narrowed, calculating. He looked at Jax, then at the rising threat, and something like cold recognition passed over his face. "Seems your war isn't finished after all," Kane said softly. "Let's see what kind of man you really are." The hangman's shadow stretched longer still. The cry from the wall hadn't finished echoing when Dusthaven's square broke into chaos. "Riders! East Ridge!" The words tore through the crowd like a whip crack. Men and women scattered, grabbing children, running for weapons. The guards, holding Jax, hesitated, rifles swinging between him and the horizon where the dust clouds churned. Jax lifted his head, eyes narrowing against the glare. He didn't need a spyglass to know who it was. He could feel it in his bones. The warband hadn't been broken. Not yet. They'd gathered again, stronger, hungry for revenge. Captain Kane barked orders like a hammer striking steel. "Mount the walls! Form ranks!" His men scrambled, trained soldiers moving with precision, though their faces betrayed unease. Then his gaze snapped back to Jax. "Cut him loose." The guards froze. "Sir?" "You heard me," Kane snapped. "If this is his war, let him. Fight it." The ropes around Jax's wrists fell away. He rolled his shoulders, rubbing the raw skin, and gave Kane a long, measured look. "You sure you want the Butcher of Carrion Ridge at your side?" Kane's jaw tightened. "I want every gun I can get." Jax's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Fair enough." Ilara rushed to him, pressing his old revolver into his hand. "Don't you dare leave me in this fight," she said, fierce and trembling. He met her eyes, and in them found the anchor he'd been missing for years. He nodded once. Not a chance. From the ridge, the warband descended like a storm. 100 riders at least, banners tattered, their cries carrying across the wasteland. Dust plumed under hooves, the sun glinting off sabers and rifles. Inside the walls, Dusthaven braced. Farmers with pitchforks stood shoulder to shoulder with miners clutching battered rifles. Kane's riders took the high points, forming lines, their discipline stark against the ragged defenders. Jax strode to the gate, revolver heavy in his hand, knife at his belt. Ilara moved with him, bow slung across her back, arrows rattling in a borrowed quiver. "You stay behind me," Jax muttered. She gave him a sharp look. Not this time. And he didn't argue. Not anymore. The first wave hit like thunder. Raiders crashed against the walls, firing, howling, hurling grappling hooks to drag themselves up. Kane's rifles cracked in unison, dropping riders in the dust. Dusthaven's folk loosed what shots they had, arrows and musket balls raining down, but the warband was relentless. For every man cut down, 2 more pressed forward. The gates shuddered under the pounding of a battering ram, wood splintering. Jax and Kane found themselves shoulder to shoulder atop the wall, rifles barking, smoke curling around them. Kane glanced at him between shots, expression hard. "You fight like a soldier," he said grimly. Jax fired again, reloading quick. "I ain't. Could have fooled me." Below, the gate cracked. Splinters flew. "Fall back," Kane shouted. "To the square!" The gate burst inward, and the raiders poured through like a black tide. What followed was chaos. Steel on steel. Smoke. Screams. The square became a killing ground. Dusthaven's defenders fought like cornered wolves, striking with desperation. Kane's men tried to hold formation, but the raiders broke through in savage knots, cutting down. Anyone in their path, Jax moved through it all like a blade through smoke, his revolver never still, knife flashing. Every motion was survival honed by years on the fringe. Ilara was at his back, loosing arrows into the press, each one finding its mark. She was no victim now. She was a fighter born of fire and blood. And Kane? Kane fought with the cold precision of a man who'd killed for country, not coin. His saber sang, his pistol cracked, his commands still cut through the roar. But still, the warband pressed. And then Jax saw him, the warlord. A mountain of a man, helm made of bone, scars twisted across his chest. His roar carried above the din as he drove his riders forward, cutting a path straight for the heart of Dusthaven. Jax's gut tightened. He knew that face. He'd seen it years ago when Carrion Ridge burned. This was the man who started it. The butcher of Carrion Ridge, and the bastard wore the name like armor while Jax had carried the blame. "Elara!" Jax bellowed, dragging her with him as he shoved through the melee. "We end this!" They fought their way to the warlord, every step paid in blood. Kane saw where they were headed and forced his way to their flank, cutting down raiders to clear a path. For the first time, outlaw and officer fought not as enemies, but as brothers in arms. The warlord swung a massive axe, cleaving men apart, his laughter booming over the slaughter. When his eyes fell on Jax, recognition flared. "You!" he roared. "The dog they blamed!" Jax's teeth bared. "Your mess, my gallows. That ends here." He fired. The bullet struck the warlord's shoulder, spinning him, but not dropping him. The giant came on, axe raised high. Jax dodged, the blade tearing a furrow in the dirt. Elara loosed an arrow that bit deep into the raider's side, staggering him. Kane's saber flashed, carving a line across his arm. Still he stood. Then Jax was inside his guard, knife flashing, plunging deep beneath the bone helm. The warlord's eyes went wide. He staggered, choking, then collapsed to the dust. For a moment, silence. Then the warband faltered. Without their leader, their fury broke. Some fought on, but most scattered, wheeling their horses, vanishing into the desert. Dusthaven still stood. Barely. But it stood. The survivors gathered in the smoking square, bodies strewn like shadows. Kane stood over the warlord's corpse, his saber red, his face unreadable. Slowly, he looked to Jax. "You killed him," Kane said flatly. Jax wiped blood from his knife, took the blame for him long enough. Kane studied him, then spoke loud enough for all to hear. "The governor sent me to bring back the butcher of Carrion Ridge. I found him today. He's dead." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jax stared, not trusting his ears. "What are you saying, Kane?" Kane sheathed his blade. "I'm saying Dusthaven has no butcher. Just a man who fought to keep it alive." The words lifted the weight that had chained Jax's soul for years. For the first time, the shadow of the noose felt far away. Elara stepped close, hand finding his. Her eyes were wet, fierce, unbroken. The war was over, for now. But Jax knew the desert never stayed quiet for long, and in the silence after the blood, he realized he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The sun rose heavy and red over Dusthaven, as if the desert itself had bled through the night. Smoke curled from smoldering beams. The air stank of iron, gunpowder, and charred wood. Crows circled, waiting for the living to look away. In the square, the survivors gathered. Men and women with torn clothes, bandaged limbs, and hollow eyes. Some leaned on one another, others stood rigid as stone, refusing to bend even in grief. Children clung to skirts and calloused hands, their faces smeared with ash. And in the center of it all lay the bodies. Shrouded in blankets, lined in rows, each one a hole torn from the fabric of Dusthaven. Jax stood at the edge, hat in his hands, dirt and blood streaking his face. Elara was beside him, her arm wrapped in a rough bandage where a raider's blade had grazed her. She hadn't said a word since dawn, her silence speaking louder than anything else. Kane stepped forward, his uniform torn and blackened, his voice steady despite the rasp in his throat. "We stand," he said, eyes sweeping across the crowd. "That's more than the warband can say. But it cost us." His words hung in the morning air. No one cheered, no one cursed. Just silence. The kind of silence only loss can buy. "We'll bury them proper," Kane continued. And when the governor hears of this, he'll know Dusthaven did not fall. You'll get supplies, reinforcements. This won't happen again. Murmurs rippled, some bitter, some grateful. Promises from far-off governors felt thin against the weight of graves. Jack said nothing. He couldn't. His throat was raw, his heart heavier than the iron he used to carry in his saddlebags. These weren't nameless folk. He'd seen them laugh around fires, barter at market stalls, haul water with quiet strength. And now they were gone, because violence had come for him, and the desert had followed. Ilara reached for his hand. For once, she didn't look at him like a savior or a teacher, just a man standing under the same sun, carrying the same hurt. By mid-morning, the ground outside the walls was broken earth. Graves stretched in neat lines, marked with wood planks or nothing at all. Sweat-streaked faces as shovels bit into the soil. Dusthaven buried its dead with its own hands. Jax dug with the rest, muscles aching, breath ragged. No one told him to. No one dared stop him either. Every shovelful of earth felt like penance, though he knew no grave could bury his ghosts. At one point, Kane came to stand beside him, shovel in hand. For a time they worked in silence. Finally Kane spoke, his tone even, stripped of rank. You've carried their sins long enough. Jax didn't look up. Doesn't wash him away. No, Kane said, but it matters that you stood when it counted. Jax leaned on his shovel, staring at the rows. Funny thing, you fight long enough, you forget what counts. Kane gave him a glance that wasn't unfriendly. Maybe you're remembering now. They dug until the sun climbed high, until the sweat stung their eyes and the ground was full of the fallen. And when the last mound was covered, the people of Dusthaven bowed their heads. No priest spoke, no hymn was sung, just silence, and the desert wind carrying away what words could not. Later, Jax found Ilara near the remains of the clinic. The roof had half collapsed, supplies burned. She was on her knees, sorting through ash, pulling out what little could be saved. A jar of herbs, cracked but usable. A bundle of gauze, blackened but not consumed. You should rest, Jax said quietly. She didn't look at him. They'll need me more than ever. Rest can wait. Jax crouched beside her, picking up a scorched satchel. His hands shook as he brushed away the soot. Ain't fair. You survive hell, only to wake up in another. Her eyes flicked to his, tired but sharp. Fair? You think the desert owes us that? He almost smiled. Guess not. She sat back, wiping sweat from her brow with a streak of ash. You could leave, you know. Nobody here would stop you now. Kane gave you back your name. You're free. Jax studied her, the way her hands trembled even as she worked, the set of her jaw. Could. But then who's going to teach you to shoot straighter? For the first time that day, a small, weary smile tugged at her lips. Guess I'll keep you around then. By dusk, the worst of the fires were out, the graves covered, the wounded tended as best as could be. The town gathered in the square again, not to mourn this time, but to reckon. Kane stood before them, Jax and Ilara at his side. His voice carried with the weight of command, but there was something more in it now, respect, maybe even humility. The warband is broken, he said, but the desert breeds more like them. Dusthaven will not be left undefended. I'll send riders to the capital, call for reinforcements, supplies, arms. A murmur of approval. Some still looked doubtful, but hope, however thin, sparked in their eyes. Then Kane gestured to Jax. And as for him, the crowd stiffened, whispers flaring. The butcher, the outlaw, the man who'd killed and vanished into the wasteland. Kane raised his hand for silence. The butcher of Carrion Ridge died yesterday, with the warlord who wore his crimes. This man stood with us when it mattered. Without him and her, he nodded to Ilara, Dust Haven would be ash. The words settled like a stone dropped. In water. Some nodded, some crossed their arms, others turned away, unwilling to forgive so easily. Jax didn't ask them to. When the crowd began to disperse, Kane caught his arm. "You could come with me when the relief arrives. Put those skills to use for something larger than survival." Jax met his gaze, seeing the offer for what it was. Not chains, not a gallows, but a chance. A different kind of war. He shook his head. "I've ridden for flags before. Didn't end well." Kane studied him, then gave a short nod. "Then do what you do best. Survive." That night, the desert was quiet. No war cries, no gunfire, just the crackle of small fires and the murmur of exhausted voices. Jax and Alara sat outside the half-burned clinic, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders against the desert chill. The stars stretched wide above them, cold and endless. "You think Kane's right?" Alara asked softly. "That the desert'll send more?" Jax stared at the horizon, where the ridge loomed black against the stars. "Always does." Question: do we meet it as victims, or as something stronger? She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Then I guess you'd better keep teaching me." He glanced down at her, the firelight catching the tired determination in her eyes. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jax felt something stir in him that wasn't anger or guilt. Hope. Fragile, but real. The desert would come again. It always did. But when it did, he wouldn't be standing alone. Not anymore. The desert had a way of swallowing memory. Tracks vanished with the wind. Bones turned to dust. Fires left only black scars on the earth, soon covered by drifting sand. But not everything was forgotten. 3 weeks after the siege, Dust Haven still bore its wounds. Charred beams jutted from rooftops. Walls were patched with scrap iron and wagon boards. Yet life had returned, stubborn as mesquite. Children chased one another in the square, their laughter brittle but real. Merchants had reopened stalls, trading in grain, cloth, and bullets. The graves outside town were marked with crude crosses, each one weathering under the relentless sun, each one a reminder. And on the far edge of the settlement, 2 horses waited, saddled and restless. Jax tightened the cinch on his bay, his hands steady despite the weight in his chest. Beside him, Alara packed a bundle into her saddlebag, gauze, tinctures, a battered pistol. She moved with quiet purpose, no hesitation. "Never. Thought I'd leave this place," she murmured, tying off the flap. "But I guess staying would have been harder." Jax adjusted his hat against the glare. "You'll miss it?" "Parts of it," she admitted, looking toward the clinic. The roof was patched, smoke curling from its chimney. A young apprentice, barely, more than a boy, was sweeping the front steps. "I taught Nathan enough to manage. He's green, but he'll grow." Jax followed her gaze. "Town'll need him. Dust Haven's not done fighting." "No," she said, swinging up into her saddle. "But it's not our fight anymore. At least not only ours." They rode out slow, hooves crunching over the hardpan, eyes of townsfolk trailing after them. Some nodded with respect, others with suspicion. A few children waved shyly, as though uncertain if the outlaw and the healer were heroes or simply another storm passing through. Neither Jax nor Alara looked back. By midday, they had left the walls behind, the town shrinking into the endless horizon. The desert stretched before them, miles of sand, ridges jagged like broken teeth, the wind carrying the dry taste of dust. For hours, they rode in silence, each lost in thought. It wasn't until they crested a ridge that Alara finally spoke. "Where?" "Do we go now?" Jax reined in, scanning the vast land below. The world was wide and wild, dotted with canyons, riverbeds, and the faint smoke of distant camps. "There's always places need fighting hands. Settlements too small for the law to care, folk too poor to pay for protection. Her eyes narrowed. And you'd ride from one to the next, putting out fires until you burn yourself out? He almost smiled. Ain't that what you signed up for? She nudged her horse closer. I signed up to survive. You taught me that. But surviving ain't enough anymore. He studied her face, weathered by hardship, yet lit by something fierce. Then what is? Her gaze swept the horizon, unflinching. Living, and making sure others get the chance to. The words settled into him like water into dry earth. Maybe that was what had been missing all these years, not just surviving the desert, but finding a reason worth the fight. That night, they made camp in a dry arroyo. Jax built the fire low, the flames flickering against stone. Ilara sat across from him, unwrapping her bandage. The wound on her arm had knitted well, a thin scar tracing her skin. You healed fast, Jax said. She flexed her hand, testing it. Scars remind us where we've been. Jax glanced at his own hands, calloused and cut, each mark a story he didn't care to retell. Got enough scars to fill a book. Her eyes softened. Maybe it's time you wrote a new one. He met. Her gaze across the fire, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. For years, he'd carried nothing but ghosts, their voices louder than the living. But Ilara wasn't a ghost. She was here, flesh and blood, stubborn as the desert itself. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jax thought maybe he wasn't doomed to ride alone. Days passed. They moved like shadows through the wasteland, skirting warband trails, keeping off the main routes where caravans sometimes vanished under sudden attack. They came upon burned wagons, their cargo looted. A family's camp left in ruins, graves, fresh and shallow. Raiders weren't done with this land. They never would be. At each ruin, Ilara would dismount, kneel among the ashes, leave a marker if none stood. Jax would keep watch, rifle in hand, his jaw tight. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, they reached the ridge where Jax had first found her, chained, broken, left for dead. He stopped his horse, staring at the blackened posts, still jutting from the earth. The chains were gone, scavenged or swallowed by sand. But the memory hung heavy in the air. Ilara dismounted, standing beside him. Strange, isn't it? To see it again. Strange, he agreed, his voice low. If I'd ridden another mile that day, never looked this way. Her hand touched his arm, grounding him. But you did. And we're here. For a long moment they stood in silence, the desert wind whispering through the scrub. Then, with a steady breath, they turned their horses and rode on, leaving the place to the dust. Weeks later, word of their deeds in Dust Haven had begun to spread. Whispers carried from settlement to settlement, half-truths and legend already shaping the tale. Some called them vigilantes, others called them saviors. Most didn't know their names, only that two figures had broken a warband and saved a town from fire. Jax didn't care what they called him. Names were just another kind of chain. But Ilara, she listened. She saw the way people's faces lit when they heard the story, even if twisted by rumor. And in those moments, she knew. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were becoming something larger, symbols in a land that needed them. On a cold night beneath a blanket of stars, Ilara asked the question that had lingered unspoken for weeks. Do you ever think we'll find peace? A place we can stop running, stop fighting? Jax poked at the fire, the embers glowing red. He didn't answer at first. The desert had taught him peace was a rare thing, fleeting as rain. Finally, he looked at her. Maybe, maybe not. But if there's such a place, reckon we'll find it, together. She smiled faintly, the firelight catching the resolve in her eyes. Then that's enough. The fire crackled, the desert stretched endless, and two riders sat shoulder to shoulder against the night, not as outlaw and survivor, not as teacher and student, but as partners. And somewhere in the dark horizon, beyond the ridges and the ruins, another storm was brewing. But when it came, the desert would find them ready, together. Thank you for being here and sharing this story with me. If you're ready for more, just click on the next one waiting for you right now. And please remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so we can keep exploring new stories together.